Part 3 of Rebels of the Red Planet by Charles Louis Fontenay. Read by Mark Douglas Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Rebels of the Red Planet, Chapter 5. Maya Karanome looked from her furnished room through cracked shutters at the building across the street. A barber college. The building at 49 Sage Avenue, Mars City, was a barber college. That surprised her. She didn't know exactly what she had expected. A hospital, perhaps, or even a kindergarten. But a barber college? But the source of the information she had received, that 49 Sage Avenue was the address she sought, was unimpeachable. She had ferreted it out, after a long time and through devious ways, and she was sure she could trust it. "The Childress Barber College," read the neatly lettered sign above the door. Maya's landlady, moon-faced Mrs. Chan, had pointed out Oxivane Childress to her as he left the building one day. A big man, comfortably stomached, with a heavy brown beard, which, even at that distance, she could see was shot with gray. As innocent as you please. Childress came out and went in. The students went in and came out. Still, it was the address she had been given. Maya had to gain entrance to the building. She could learn nothing from watching it from outside. She was established here as a tourist from Earth. Besides, the position and activities of women were prescribed rigidly by Martian colonial convention, and women did not study to become barbers on Mars. She would have to have help. She thought at once of Newell, and as immediately rejected him. "Maya, I don't see why you insist on working alone," he had complained. "I can set the whole machinery of government in motion to help you, whenever you need it." "Primarily because you're well known and your activities are observed," she had answered. "Your whole government machinery hasn't been effective in tracking down the rebel headquarters yet, and it's reasonable to assume that the rebels have a fairly effective intelligence network. My job is to find that headquarters, and if I were seen very often with you or tried to utilize your government machinery, they'd have me pinpointed pretty soon." She left the window, filled a tiny basin with precious water, shrugged out of her negligee, and sponged her small, perfect body. She donned form-fitting tunic, briefs, and short skirt, pulled on knee-length socks, and laced-up Martian walking shoes. She spent some time preparing her hair and face. Then she left the room and the house and walked uptown. The walk was about a kilometer, along sidewalks bordered by cubical, functional houses, and trim lawns of terrestrial grass and small trees. Above the city, its dome was opalescent in the morning sun. The small houses gave way to larger business buildings, also cubical, and the lawns dwindled and vanished. Farther down, the buildings were even larger and the streets were wider and busier. But she was not going into the heart of Mars City. She turned into an office building and studied the directory in the lobby. The offices were those of doctors and lawyers. On the directory she found Charlworth Syon, attorney at law, room 207. There was no elevator. Maya walked up the stairs and down a corridor, finding a door that had nothing on it but the number. She turned the knob and went in. The small outer office was uninhabited. It was carpeted and desked, with 2 straight chairs against a wall for clients. Through a door she could see part of the inner office, cluttered and stacked with papers and books. She stood there, hesitating. The outer door clicked shut behind her. At the sound, a gray-haired, preoccupied man with spectacles and stooped shoulders peered from the inner office. "Oh," he said, "I'm sorry. My secretary went to lunch a bit early today. Can I help you, miss?" "I'm looking for Mr. Syon," she said. "I'm Charlworth Syon." "Terra outshines the sun," said Maya. Syon's eyes were suddenly wary behind the spectacles. "Well, well," he murmured. "Come in, please." She went into the cluttered inner office, and Syon closed and locked the door. "And you are—" said Cyan behind the desk, his pale hands fumbling aimlessly with papers. "Maya Kara Nome," she said. Cyan found a paper and scanned it. He apparently found her name there. "I'm surprised to see you here," he admitted. "Our information was that you would be working entirely alone." "I am," said Maya. "Or I was. I was told not to contact you unless I had to, Mr. Cyan, but it seems I'm going to need some help." Cyan inclined his head, but said nothing. "As you may or may not know, my specific assignment is to locate the nerve center of rebellious activity," said Maya. "It seems that the rebels have an intelligence network about as effective as the government's, and it was felt that a woman tourist from Earth might be successful where any unusual probing by local agents might arouse suspicion." "That's true," conceded Cyan. "I doubt that they're really sure of the identity of more than a few of our agents, but sometimes I think they have a card file on every person on Mars. We have to be very careful that movements of our agents are consistent with their pretended occupations." "I have a reliable tip that their nerve center is the Childress Barber College here," she said. "I can't find out anything, though, unless I get into the building over a period of time. As a woman, I can't very well apply to study barbering." "No," said Cyan. "I see your problem." He turned to a filing cabinet, unlocked it, and searched through it, whistling tunelessly. He found a folder, pulled it out, and studied it. "If it is, they've certainly kept it well covered," he said. "There's not a mark of suspicion entered against the Childress Barber College. But here's a possibility for getting you in. The Barber College employs one secretary, female. Now, if you could take her place—" Maya smiled. "I might as well apply as a barber student," she said. "You propose to remove a trusted member of their own group from their midst and replace her with a complete unknown?" "We don't know that she's a rebel," answered Cyan. "If she isn't, she can be lured away to another job at a much better salary. If she is, and can't be lured, well, there are other methods. The Mars City Employment Agency is operated by one of our agents, and you'll be the only secretary available when the Barber College asks for a woman to fill her place. Believe me, Miss Kara Nome, as easy as it is for a woman to get married on Mars, it is difficult to find women to do any sort of business work. It won't seem at all strange that you're the only one available." "The only trouble is that I'm known in the neighborhood as a tourist from Earth," objected Maya. "Well," said Cyan, "things have been more expensive than you planned for on Mars. You've run short of money. You have to work for a while to pay living expenses here until the next ship leaves for Earth." "My account at the bank?" "It will vanish quietly from the records," said Cyan with a smile. "The bank is a government institution." "Very well," said Maya, taking her purse from his desk. "Let me know when I'm to apply." "You won't hear from me again," said Cyan, shaking his head. "The employment agency will notify you to appear at the Barber College for an interview." Maya knew of Cyan only as her emergency contact on Mars. She did not know what position he held in that underground network of terrestrial agents which was largely unknown even to Newell Ely, the government prosecutor. But whatever his position, he got things done in a hurry. Within 2 weeks, Maya was typing up applications, examination reports, and supply orders in the Childress Barber College, joking and flirting with barber students between classes, and naively declaiming to her ostensible employer, phlegmatic Oxvein Childress, how lucky it was for her that she was able to get a job right across the street from her rooming house. "The work's easy," rumbled Childress, explaining her tasks to her. "Any time you want to take a coffee break with any of the young men, or go uptown shopping, go ahead, as long as the work gets done. Just one thing, you have to stay up here in the front of the building, and don't ever go back in the classrooms. The instructors are mighty strict about that, and that's one rule I won't stand to be violated." This significant restriction convinced Maya she was on the right track. but she needed to move cautiously if she was not to arouse immediate suspicion. So she adhered strictly to her role for nearly a month, keeping her eyes open. If it was a rebel operation, it was almost perfectly disguised. Childress performed the duties of the administrative head of the Barber College, and nothing more. The students, about 50 of them, went in and out at regular school hours, and she became casually acquainted with a good many of them. The half-dozen instructors, whom she also came to know, were less regular in their movements, but she could detect nothing suspicious about them. "We cut the hair of Mars," was the college's motto, and she learned that it was the larger of only 2 barber colleges on the planet. Apparently, it actually did supply graduate barbers to all the dome cities. It took in customers for the students to practice on, and, although many of them were strangers, some of them were prominent Mars City citizens whom she knew by sight. There was no question about it. Partially, at least, it was a legitimate barber college, whatever other activities it might mask. The only thing noticeably unusual on the surface was that it was extremely selective in its approval of students who applied for courses in barbering. She discerned that through her processing of the applications. If she was going to find out anything definite, she would have to get into the forbidden rear portion of the building. But obviously there were legitimate classrooms there, in addition to the activities she suspected, and if she were caught nosing around the classrooms, she would be discharged at once for violation of the rules, without finding out what she sought. She would have to hit it right the first time. Biding her time and watching, she was able to learn, almost intuitively, from the movements of students, customers, and instructors, that the classrooms in which barbering was actually taught were all concentrated on the western side of the building. If there were any more sinister activities, they occurred on the opposite side. Having determined this, she planned her course of action. Near the end of her first month at work, she chose her time one day when Childress was downtown, leaving her alone in the business office. The afternoon classes were in full swing. Taking along a filled-out order form as an excuse, Maya walked quickly down the corridor that stretched across the front of the building. Carefully and quietly, she pushed open the door at the extreme end of the corridor, a little surprised, as a matter of fact, to find it unlocked. She was in another corridor that struck straight back to the rear of the building. She hesitated. There were doors spaced all along both sides of this corridor. Did she dare attempt to open one, on the chance that the room behind it was unoccupied? Then she saw that one door, a little way down, stood half open. Quietly, she walked down the hall, not quite to the door, but near enough to it to be able to see a large area of the room behind it. There were people in there. In the part she was able to see, there were half a dozen students seated, and one of the instructors standing among them. Fortunately, their backs were to her. Whatever they were studying, it was not barbering. There was an occasional murmur of voices, but she could not make out the words. Then she saw. On the table at the front of the room, which the students faced, there was a big barber's basin. As she watched, the basin slowly raised off the table and moved upward a few inches. No one was near it, but it floated there, quivering and tilting a little in the air. And then from it, slowly, the water itself came up in a weird fountain, moved completely free of the basin, and hung above it in the air, gradually assuming the form of a globe. Telekinesis. This was a class in telekinesis. The students were concentrating on the basin and water, and lifting them into the air by the power of their minds. This was indeed the heart of the rebel movement. She had found what she sought. "Aren't you where you shouldn't be, young lady?" asked a calm, masculine voice behind her. Shocked, terrified, she whirled. A tall, handsome, dark-haired man she had never seen before was standing there, observing her quizzically. His pale eyes seemed to look through her and beyond her. She forced herself to casual composure. "I don't believe I've met you," she said. "Are you one of the instructors?" "I'm Dark Kensington, one of the supervisors," he replied. and you're Miss Kara Nome, the secretary, who shouldn't be back here." Had he noticed that she saw the telekinetic action? She glanced back at the classroom. The basin was now comfortably ensconced back on the table, full of water. "I had this order, which I thought was of an emergency nature," she said, offering it to him. "Mr. Childress wasn't in, and I thought I'd better find one of the instructors so it could be approved and go out right away." Dark took it and glanced at it. "I doubt that its emergency nature is as grave as you may have thought," he said soberly. "However, Mr. Childress would be better qualified to judge that. You understand that I shall have to report this infraction of the rules to him." Suddenly, Maya was overwhelmed by an utterly terrifying sensation. It seemed that these pale blue eyes were looking into her mind, searching, seeking to determine her thoughts and her true intention. Instinctively, not knowing how she did it, she veiled her thoughts with a psychic barrier. And, instinctively, she recognized that he detected the barrier and could not penetrate it. Telepathy? Why not, if they were experimenting successfully with telekinesis? "I'm sorry," she murmured hurriedly, and brushed past him. He did not try to detain her. She hurried back to the office. She hurried, but as she hurried down first the one corridor and then the other, she discovered that her steps were slowing involuntarily. A powerful force seemed to be detaining her, attempting to draw her back. Frightened, but curious, she attempted to analyze this force even as she struggled against it. She could not be sure, it was disturbing either way, but she could not be sure whether it was a telepathic thing or merely the magnetic force of this man's powerful masculine personality that pulled at her. In a state of mental turmoil, she reached the office. Childress was not yet back. Should she wait for him? Then, as suddenly as she had sensed Dark Kensington's telepathic probing, she sensed something else. Somewhere, in the back of the building, he was talking to another man she had not seen before, and within 10 minutes Dark Kensington would be in this office. And the prospect she faced was far more serious than mere discharge for infringement of company rules. She had to get in touch with Newell at once. She recognized that if she could get out of this building and across the street to her rooming house, she would be safe for a little while. She could telephone Newell from there. Grabbing her purse, she hastened out of the office. 6. The three men who stood by a table in the back lobby of the Childress Barber College and checked off the departure of the men at regularly spaced intervals were as different in appearance as they were in their positions in the Order of the Phoenix. Ox Vane Childress, big and bearded, was the front, and directed the very necessary task of administering the Childress Barber College as a genuine barber college. Childress was a prominent member of 2 of Mars City's civic and social clubs, and careful examination of his activities over a period of years would have thrown no suspicion on him. The chief, whose real name perhaps Childress knew but never spoke, was a huge-headed midget who directed the far-flung activities of the Order of the Phoenix as an underground rebel organization. He never left the building, but reports were brought in to him from all over Mars. He knew a great deal at any time about what the government and MarsCorp were doing, and he gave the orders for those moves aimed at maintaining the secrecy of the Phoenix. Dark Kensington, tall and pale-eyed, had moved at once into the natural position of guiding the experimental work of the organization in extrasensory perception and telekinesis. He was able to add his knowledge of earlier work to the progress that had been made since his disappearance, and coordinated the studies in the various dome cities. A little behind the three stood Fancher Ladigan, doing the actual checking with a pencil on a list in his hand. "I think it's all unnecessary," rumbled Childress unhappily. "I watched the girl carefully while she was here, and the usual checks were made into her background. It's true she had some social contacts with Newell Eli when she first came to Mars, but there's nothing sinister about that association, and it seems the last thing a MarsCorp agent would do openly. As far as I could determine, she just realized she'd violated a rule and would be discharged for it, so she left before she could be discharged."
"She hasn't returned to her rooming house," remarked the chief in his high, thin voice.
"Looking for another job, or maybe just on a trip," said Childress. "After all, she's a terrestrial tourist. If this is all a false alarm, how am I going to explain suspending operation of the college for a period?"
"Remodeling," replied the chief. "Work out the details, and put a sign up as soon as evacuation has progressed far enough."
"It may be unnecessary, Oxvane," said Dark, "but it's best not to take chances. This telepathy is a very uncertain thing, and sometimes it's hard to differentiate true telepathic communication from one's own hopes or fears. But it seemed to me that I had the very definite sense that Miss Karen Nome was seeking something with hostile intent, and it's entirely possible that she saw part of one of the experiments through that open door." Two students appeared, gave their names to Fancher in an undertone, and sauntered out the back door of the building.
"What's the status now?" asked the chief.
"They were 19 and 20, answered Fancher precisely. "They're part of Group C, which is going to Hesperidum. Group A goes to Regina, Group B to Charax, Group D to Nuba, and Group E to Ismenius." "None to Solus?" asked Childress in surprise.
"No, sir, nor to Phoenicius either," answered Fancher. "They're both so far, and Solus is a resort where they might be easier to detect. We're using both public transport and private ground cars. All of them so far have reported safely through the flower shop, except these last two, so the government evidently hasn't thrown a ring around the building yet."
"And I don't think they will either," growled Childress. "I tell you, it's all unnecessary."
"Are things going smoothly here?" asked the chief.
"Yes, sir," replied Fancher. "The last 5 men scheduled to leave are taking care of any customers who come in, and the rest of them are packing supplies into the trucks. As soon as I get word from the flower shop that the last pair has cleared, I give another pair the word to leave."
"It seems to be moving along well," said the chief, and he turned his green eyes upon Childress. "Is the business office manned?"
Why, there's no one there right now," said Childress, taken aback.
"I think it would look extremely peculiar to any investigator if you weren't there, frantically trying to locate a new secretary," said the chief quietly.
Childress left in confusion. The chief turned to Dark.
"I think Fancher's handling this very well without my help," he said. "You know where your ground car is, if we all have to make a run for it?"
"Yes," answered Dark. "We won't be going together?"
"No,"
replied the chief, and his lips twisted in a faint smile.
"I have my own method of exit, which should give them other things to think about."
He left, moving with quick, short steps. Dark stayed for a few moments more, then he too went back into the building to help with packing. The Lowland Flower Shop, on the other side of Mars City, near the west airlock, was the clearance point for the evacuees. The flower shop was operated by a Phoenix agent, and each pair that left the Barber College passed through there before leaving the city, to let those behind know that they had not been stopped by government men. Other Phoenix agents watched the heliport and bus station for any evidence that the government was trying to block those routes out of Mars City. The evacuation moved steadily, and it began to appear that Childress was right. Singly, the first 2 of the 5 trucks moved out, and all of the ESP instructors and 32 of the students had reported back safe clearance from the flower shop, when— Dark was moving a stack of charts from one of the classrooms to the basement, when bells all over the building set up a tremendous clangor. Immediately the quiet evacuation dissolved into an uproar, with men running and shouting, and the bell ringing incessantly. Dark knew what had happened. Childress, in the front office, had seen government agents approaching, or perhaps they had actually entered the building. He had pressed the alarm bell, then sought to delay them with the righteous indignation suitable to the administrative head of a barber college, which is invaded by government officials. The bell stopped suddenly, and the scattered shouting sounded strange and thin in the comparative silence. Then the piping voice of the chief came over the loudspeakers spread throughout the building.
"Attention," said the chief.
"We are temporarily safe. The alarm automatically sealed all doors to the building behind the front corridor. Kensington, please come to my office. The rest of you, tie up the customers still here and leave them unharmed, and then leave the building by the emergency exits. Scatter, and make your way by whatever private transportation method you can to the rendezvous assigned to your respective group. Do not use public transportation, because Mars Corp will undoubtedly be checking public transport now." Dark set the charts down on the stairs and made his way back to the chief's office. The chief was sitting, tiny behind his big desk, his face as serene as ever. He was puffing casually on one of the long Hadriacum cigars. Dark laughed. "You don't have another one of those cigars, do you?" he asked. For the first time since he had been there, Dark saw the chief's mouth break into a full, broad smile. "I think so," said the chief, an undertone of delight bubbling in his voice. He reached into the desk and pulled one out. Dark accepted it gravely and lit it. "The last 2 evacuees haven't reported to the flower shop, and they're overdue," said the chief, his face getting serious. "Childress hasn't reported back here by telephone either, so the Mars Corp gang probably had already entered the building before he detected them and sounded the alarm." "What about Childress?" asked Dark. "What will happen to him?" "He'll take the rap," answered the chief. "His defense will be that if there were any Phoenix activities going on here, he didn't know about it. He was just running a barber college in good faith. I don't think they can prove otherwise." "Do we have any idea what our situation is?" asked Dark. "A very accurate idea. We have observers posted in the 2 houses at the ends of our emergency exits, and they've been reporting to Fancher in the next room by telephone. There's a force of about 100 Mars City policemen and plainclothes agents in the streets all around the building. They saw a squad go into the front, but evidently they didn't have enough warning to let Childress know in time." "Will the doors hold?" The chief's mouth quirked. "They'll need demolition equipment to break them down," he said. "All these have are heat guns and tear gas. One of the observers farther downtown said he saw a tank coming this way, but if they don't already know there are innocent customers in here, Childress will tell them." "Then everybody gets away but Childress." "We hope. They're not going to ignore the surrounding houses, especially with men drifting out of them and moving away. That's why I want to stress the importance of one thing to you, Kensington. You are too important for us to lose at this juncture. With your knowledge of the original work done, that house at the end of your exit will have a dozen or so of our men in it, waiting to drift away one by one. But you can't afford to worry about them. I want you to get in that ground car alone and take off like Phobos Rising." "You're going out the other emergency exit?" "That's none of your business. But, as a matter of fact, no. If you want to see something that will throw consternation into this Mars Corp outfit, watch the roof of this building. Now, get moving, Kensington, and good luck. Fancher and I will be leaving as soon as he gets all the records packed." The chief held out his tiny hand, and Dark shook hands with him. Then Dark left, went down into the basement, and entered an underground door in its eastern wall. He had to crawl through the tunnel driven through the sand under the street. He emerged in the basement of a house across the street, which ostensibly was owned by Manfall Kingran, a retired space engineer. He went upstairs. About half the personnel of the barber college, who had not been caught by the alarm, were roaming the rooms of the small house, drifting singly out the back door at 10-minute intervals. Dark went to the front window and looked across the street at the barber college. The street was full of men carrying heat pistols, moving restlessly, facing the Barber College. Some of them were in police uniform. Squads of them moved about on the college grounds, and a few were in the yards of houses on this side of the street. Dark watched the roof. As he did so, from its center, a helicopter rose into the air, hovering over the building, moving upward slowly. So that was the chief's escape method. He had smuggled a helicopter into the domed city itself. But how was he to get out of the city in it? The appearance of the copter threw the men outside into confused excitement. They ran about, aiming their short-range heat beams futilely up at the rising copter. A military tank, undoubtedly the one the chief had been told about, spun around the corner. It stopped, and its guns swung upward toward the copter. But they remained silent. Heavy heat beams or artillery could puncture the city's protecting dome. The copter went straight up, gathering speed. Up, and it did not stop. It hit the plastic dome near its zenith. It tilted and staggered. It ripped through the dome and vanished. Immediately, sirens began to wail throughout the city. Doors clanged shut automatically everywhere. Lights and warning signs flashed at every street corner, advising citizens to run for the nearest airtight shelter. The dome was punctured. Emergency crews would be up within minutes to repair the break, and very little of the city's air would hiss away. But in the meantime, every activity in Mars City was snarled by the necessity to seek shelter. The chief had, indeed, created a situation of consternation in which it would be easier for the Phoenix men to elude their enemies. The armed men of the government forces were already running for the houses in this area. Some of them were heading for the house from which Dark watched. The Phoenix men were donning Mars suits. They would admit the refugees, after requiring them to lay down their arms, and then leave the house in their Mars suits. Dark grinned happily, and walked quickly through the house to the attached garage. He climbed into the ground car, started the engine, and opened the garage door by the remote control mechanism on the dashboard. Accelerating at full power, Dark drove the ground car out of the garage and spun into the street. The men afoot, seeking entrance to the houses, paid no attention. The tank began to turn ponderously in his direction, but by the time it was in a position to bring its guns to bear, Dark's ground car had reached the corner and raced around it into the broad thoroughfare leading to Mars City's east airlock. The airlock was only a dozen blocks away. The chief's theory had been that the government, depending on surprise in its move to surround the Childress Barber College, would not attempt the complicated task of checking all traffic passing through the airlock until it was realized that some of the Phoenix men had escaped from the trap at the college. Dark reached the airlock in minutes. The chief's theory proved correct. There were no police at the airlock, and the maintenance employees stationed there did not even look up as Dark's approach activated the inner door. He drove the ground car into the airlock. The inner door closed behind him. The outer door opened, and Dark drove out onto the highway that struck straight across the Syrtis Major lowland toward the Area Desert and Edom. It was as simple as that. About 10 miles out was the circular bypass highway that surrounded Mars City, and Dark proposed to turn right on that, for his destination was Hesperidum. The highway he was on would take him eastward, and Hesperidum was about 8,000 kilometers southwest of Mars City, a little better than 2 days' drive at ground-car speed on the straight, flat highways. Dark reached over and set the ground car's radio dial on the frequency which had been agreed on for emergency Phoenix broadcasts during this operation. If government monitors caught the broadcasts and jammed them, there were alternate channels chosen. With only about 24 radio stations on all Mars, plus the official aircraft and ground car band, there was plenty of free room in the air. There was nothing on the Phoenix frequency now but a little disconsolate static. The country through which he drove here was uninhabited lowland. The human life on Mars, agricultural, industrial, and commercial, was concentrated under the domes of the cities. Except for a few tiny individual domes at the edge of Mars City, there were no human structures close to it except the airport and the spaceport, and these were west and north of the city respectively. The highway struck straight and lonely through a faintly rippling sea of gray-green canal sage, spotted occasionally with the tall trunk of a canal cactus rising above it. Later he would see infrequent dome farms, but he could expect no more than 2 or 3 score of these in the entire long drive to Hesperidum. Dark slowed and entered the cloverleaf that took him onto the bypass expressway. Even as he did so, the radio crackled, and the thin voice of the chief sounded over the ground car loudspeaker.
"Attention, Phoenix," said the chief intensely. "Attention, Phoenix. Emergency instructions. We have monitor reports that the government is checking airlocks at all cities. Repeat, the government is checking airlocks at all cities. Some Phoenix have been captured attempting to leave Mars City. Instructions. Those in Mars cities do not attempt to leave, but find shelter with Phoenix friends. Those beyond the dome without credentials go to assigned emergency rendezvous spots outside dome cities. Repeat instructions. Those—"
Swearing under his breath, Dark pulled the ground car to a stop beside the highway. It was so simple. They should have foreseen that the government would take such a step as soon as it was realized that the Phoenix men were leaving Mars City. He himself evidently had gotten through the airlock just in time. But he had been assigned no outside rendezvous. Whether it was an oversight or not, he did not know, but the only place he had been instructed to go was Hesperidum. The only Phoenix contact he knew was the South Ausonia art shop in Hesperidum, and now he could not enter the city without being captured. He had only one alternative: the Martians in the Icaria Desert, halfway around Mars. They would remember him and shelter him, and he was sure he could find the spot. He looked at his fuel gauge. The tank was full. It would not take him quite there, but he could chance refueling at Solus Lacus, some 20,000 kilometers from Mars City. He could take the highway, turning out into the desert, to go around Edom, Aram, and Ophir. He put the ground car in drive again and made a U-turn in the highway. He entered the cloverleaf and was halfway through it when he saw the copter. It was a red and white government copter, and it was descending at a shallow angle toward him from the direction of Mars City. Dark switched his radio to the official channel. "Await check. Repeat. Ground car in cloverleaf. Stop at once and await check." Dark braked the ground car to a stop. As soon as the copter grounded, he could accelerate and escape. But the copter did not ground. It hovered directly over him. Then Dark realized it was awaiting a patrol car from Mars City to check and take him in custody if necessary. Immediately he put the ground car in drive and whipped out of the cloverleaf under full acceleration. If he could only achieve top speed, 350 kilometers an hour, the copter couldn't match it. But the copter was on his tail at once as he swerved out of the tight curve. Its gun spat fire. There was a terrific impact, and the ground car dome shattered above him. Unprotected, he felt the air explode from the ground car, from his lungs. Oxygenless death poured in through the broken dome. It all happened in an instant. Even as the dome shattered under the copter's shell, and Dark recognized the imminence of death, the ground car twisted out of control and careened from the highway. He felt it spinning over and over, and then blackness closed in around him. End of Chapter 6.